2 years after the Verithan Dominion declared humanity conquered, the final battle for Earth began. And Supreme Arbiter Kelos brought every ship and soldier he could spare from holding his crumbling empire together. He had decided that if he could not control humanity, then he would ensure that no one else could either. And his fleet carried weapons capable of rendering Earth uninhabitable for 1,000 years. Unipark stood in the command center of the Resistance headquarters and watched the tactical display as the massive Dominion Armada entered orbit around her homeworld, and she felt the weight of her species resting on her shoulders. Every ignited human on Earth had answered the call to defend their world, and they numbered in the millions now after the mass awakening that had occurred during the failed extermination campaign. And they stood ready to fight even though they were still outnumbered and outgunned by the alien fleet above. We cannot match them ship for ship, Una told the council that had gathered around her. But we do not need to, because this battle will not be won in space. She had devised a strategy that depended on getting human fighters aboard the Verithan vessels where their enhanced abilities would give them the advantage. And she had coordinated with resistance cells around the world to launch a simultaneous assault on every ship in the enemy fleet. The battle began at dawn when thousands of small craft launched from hidden bases across the planet and streaked toward the Dominion Armada and the Verithan point defense systems. Destroyed many of them, but not enough to stop the swarm from reaching its targets. Una led the assault on the command ship herself because she knew that the war would end when Kelos fell, and she fought her way through corridor after corridor with a team of the most powerful ignited humans at her side. The Verithan soldiers they encountered were elite warriors who had crushed rebellions on 100 worlds, but they had never faced anything like the burning fury of humans who were fighting for their home and their species and their future. Xiaojun moved with the assault teams, and his healing abilities had grown so strong that he could keep fighters on their feet even after taking wounds that should have killed them instantly. And the Verithans learned to fear the medic who made human soldiers impossible to stop. Dr. Beak was too old and too frail to fight in the battle himself. But he had one more contribution to make. He accessed the communication systems that the Resistance had captured during the war and broadcast a message across every frequency in the galaxy. And his voice reached billions of beings on thousands of worlds who were watching the battle for Earth. My name is Jinho Beak, and I am a human, he said. And I want to explain something to all of you who are watching what is happening here today. He paused and took a breath before continuing. The Verithans thought that we were finished when they conquered our world, and they believed that defeating our fleet and occupying our cities meant that they had broken our species. But they did not understand what makes humanity strong. On the command ship, Una reached the bridge and found Supreme Arbiter Kelos waiting for her with a weapon in his hand and 500 years of combat experience backing his confidence. You should not have come here alone, he said as he raised his weapon, because even with your enhancements, you cannot defeat me. Una smiled and replied that she was not alone and would never be alone because she carried the strength of her entire species inside her. They fought. Kelos was faster and stronger and more skilled than any opponent Una had ever faced, and his weapon carved wounds in her body that would have killed a normal human 10 times over. But she kept fighting because she had made a choice that her body could not override. She would not break. Dr. Beak's voice continued to echo across the galaxy as the battle raged. Our power does not come from our muscles or our weapons or our technology, he explained. And it comes from something that the Verithans could never understand because they have never felt it themselves. Una took another wound and kept fighting. It comes from our hearts, Dr. Beak said, and from our absolute refusal to accept defeat even when victory seems impossible. and from the love we feel for each other and for the people we choose to protect. Kilos struck Yuna with a blow that should have ended the fight. But she absorbed the impact and used his moment of surprise to strike back. We are not strong because we cannot be hurt, Dr. Beak continued, but because we choose to stand even when we can be broken. And that choice is the true power of humanity across Dominion space. Other species heard his words and felt something stir in their own hearts. And fleets that had been waiting to see the outcome of the battle for Earth made their decisions and began moving toward the conflict. Yuna fell to her knees and Kilos stood over her with triumph in his eyes. You fought well for a primitive, he said. But in the end, you are just one more species that could not stand against the Dominion. Yuna looked up at him and felt the fire inside her burning brighter than it ever had before. And she thought about everyone who was depending on her and everyone who had died believing that humanity would survive. You still do not understand, she said. And you never will. She moved faster than she had ever moved before, and her strike found the gap in his armor that her precognitive sense had been showing her since the fight began. And Supreme Arbiter Kilos fell. At that moment, allied fleets from a dozen newly freed species arrived in Earth orbit and added their firepower to the human assault. And the Verithan Armada found itself surrounded and outmatched. The Dominion forces retreated and Earth was free. 1 year later, Yuna stood before a council of representatives from species across the galaxy who had come together to build something new from the ashes of the Dominion. And she spoke about what humanity had learned and what they wanted to offer the galaxy. Our power was never about domination, she said, and it was always about protection and standing between the darkness and those who cannot fight it alone. She announced that ignited humans would travel to any world that asked for help and would teach others what they had learned about finding strength in purpose and refusing to surrender to despair. We will be guardians, she promised, and not conquerors. On 100 worlds that had been freed from Dominion, controlled children of a dozen different species played games where they pretended to ignite and pretended to be human and pretended to be the ones who never gave up. And across the galaxy, the flame that had been lit on Earth continued to spread and to grow and to burn away the darkness that had held so many species in chains for so long. Humanity had proven that they were not finished. They had only just begun. 18 months had passed since the Verithan Dominion declared humanity conquered, and the galaxy had changed in ways that Supreme Arbiter Kilos could never have predicted. The human resistance now controlled significant territory on Earth, including several major underground complexes, and even some surface areas that they had fortified against attack. And their success had inspired rebellions on dozens of other worlds where subjugated species had started to believe that the Dominion could be defeated. Yuna Park had become a symbol known across occupied space as Bisivis, the first flame, and her name was spoken in whispers by slaves who dreamed of freedom and shouted as a battle cry by rebels who had chosen to fight. She now led a council of ignited humans who coordinated liberation efforts, not just on Earth, but on other worlds where resistance movements had reached out for help and guidance. And the network they had built stretched across light years of Dominion territory. Dr. Beak had continued his research and made a breakthrough that explained why some humans ignited while others did not. And his discovery changed everything. The resistance thought they understood about their own power. The ignition is not random, he told Yuna and the council in a meeting that would shape the future of the war. And it is not simply triggered by stress or danger as I first believed. He pulled up data from hundreds of ignition events that had been documented across Earth and showed patterns that he had only recently recognized. The common factor in every awakening is not fear, but purpose, he explained. and specifically the purpose of protecting others or refusing to surrender even when defeat is certain. He showed them case after case where fighters had ignited not when they were afraid for their own lives, but when they were trying to save someone else or when they had made the decision to stand and fight rather than run. Our power comes from our hearts as much as our bodies, Dr. Beak said. And the ignition responds to the human spirit in ways that pure biology cannot explain. Una thought about her own awakening in the tunnel, when she had been surrounded by enemy soldiers, and she realized that she had not been thinking about her own survival in that moment, but about the fighters under her command, who would die if she did not find a way to save them. Supreme Arbiter Kelos was done waiting for his forces on Earth to solve the human problem on their own, and he assembled the largest military operation the Dominion had conducted in 300 years to crush the resistance once and for all. Thousands of warships and millions of soldiers descended on Earth with weapons designed to exterminate entire populations. And Kelos himself took command of the campaign because he refused to allow his legacy to be defined by a species that should have been forgotten. After the first week of conquest, the Dominion forces attacked human territory with overwhelming firepower and advanced tactics that had broken 100 species before, and the resistance found itself pushed back on every front as casualties mounted, and positions that had taken months to establish were overrun in hours. But something unexpected happened as the pressure increased and the threat of extinction became real. Again, humans who had never shown any sign of awakening began to ignite in numbers that Dr. Beak had never predicted, and the emergency that threatened their entire species triggered the dormant potential in millions of people who had lived through the occupation without changing. Parents protecting their children awakened the power that let them shield their families from weapons that should have killed everyone in the room. And soldiers defending civilian evacuations found strength and speed that allowed them to hold positions against forces 10 times their size. And ordinary people who had never fought in their lives discovered abilities that made them warriors. In the span of heartbeats, Kelos watched in disbelief as his extermination campaign created the very thing it was supposed to destroy. And every attack that pushed humanity closer to the edge awakened more of them to the power that burned inside their species. How is this possible? He demanded of his advisors as report after report described human fighters appearing where there had been none before. And why does killing them only seem to make them stronger? No one could give him an answer because no one in the Dominion had ever seen anything like what was happening on Earth. And the tactical models that had predicted easy victory began to show outcomes that bordered on catastrophic. Sejun led a medical corps that moved across the battlefield, keeping wounded fighters alive and returning them to combat. And his healing abilities had grown stronger under the pressure until he could mend injuries that would have been fatal just months before. Una coordinated strikes across multiple fronts with precision that seemed almost prophetic, and her tactical genius combined with her precognitive gift allowed human forces to be exactly where they needed to be at exactly the right moment. The tide began to turn as the mass ignition event gave the resistance an army of superhuman defenders who could match Verithan soldiers in ways that had seemed impossible. And the Dominion forces found themselves fighting not the scattered remnants of a conquered species, but an awakened civilization that refused to accept extinction. Reports reached Kelos from other parts of the galaxy that rebellions were erupting across Dominion space, and species that had been obedient for generations were rising up against their masters while chanting a phrase they had learned from human broadcasts. "We do not break," they shouted as they fought. And we will not break because humanity showed us that breaking is a choice and we choose to stand. Kelos stared at the strategic display that showed his empire, beginning to crack at the seams. And he felt something that he had not experienced. In 500 years of conquest, he felt fear. The flame that he had tried to extinguish on Earth had spread beyond his ability to control. And now the entire galaxy was beginning to burn. 1 year after the conquest of Earth, the human resistance had grown from scattered groups of desperate survivors into a coordinated movement that stretched across every continent. And the Verathans were beginning to notice that something had changed. Ignited humans were appearing everywhere now. And although not everyone who faced danger awakened to their dormant potential, those who did became warriors, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They were faster and stronger, and their minds worked with a clarity that normal humans could not match. And some of them had developed unique abilities that seemed tied to their personal psychology and life experiences. Commander Una Park had become one of the most powerful among them, and her ability to sense threats before they happened made her almost impossible to ambush or surprise. And the resistance fighters who served under her had started calling her Gift Combat Precognition because she seemed to know what the enemy would do before they did it. Saijin Choi had ignited during a desperate attempt to save wounded fighters after a raid went badly, and his ability to accelerate healing in himself and others through physical contact had made him the most valuable medic in the entire resistance network. Other ignited humans had developed other gifts that reflected who they were and what they cared about most. And together, they formed a core of elite fighters who could stand against Verathan soldiers, and when reports began reaching Supreme Arbiter Kelos from his commanders on Earth that described impossible things. And the reports spoke of humans who could take wounds that should kill them and keep fighting, and humans who seemed to predict attacks before they happened, and humans who moved with coordination so perfect that it appeared almost supernatural. Kelos dismissed these reports as the excuses of incompetent officers who could not control a conquered population, and he reminded his commanders that humans were biologically inferior creatures who had been defeated in 3 days and who posed no real threat to Dominion forces. But the reports kept coming, and they kept getting worse. The resistance launched their boldest operation yet when they attacked the Verathan processing facility where thousands of captured humans were being held as slave labor. And Una led a team of 50 fighters, including 20 who had ignited into a battle that should have been impossible to win. The facility was defended by 300 Verathan soldiers equipped with the best weapons and armor that the Dominion could provide. And any reasonable military assessment would have concluded that the human attack force had no chance of success. They won. Anyway, Una moved through the facility like a ghost made of fire, and her pragmative sense guided her away from danger and toward opportunities that no one else could see. And the ignited fighters who followed her struck with precision and power that the Verathans could not match. Sajan worked behind the front lines, and his healing touch kept wounded fighters in the battle when they should have been dead. And normal humans who had not yet ignited fought with desperate courage that earned them the respect of their enhanced comrades. When the battle ended, 3,000 human prisoners walked free and 280 Verathan soldiers lay dead. And the resistance had suffered only 19 casualties. More importantly, the battle had been witnessed by Verathan communication officers who had been trying to call for reinforcements, and the footage of humans defeating a superior force was transmitted across Dominion networks before anyone could stop it. On 100 conquered world species that have been subjugated by the Dominion for generations, watch humans do what they had been told was impossible. and they saw fighters who should have been crushed stand and fight and win. And something that had been dormant in their own hearts began to stir. Kilos finally took notice when his advisors showed him the footage and the casualty reports that could not be explained away as exaggeration. And he watched humans move in ways that no biological creature should be able to move and survive wounds that should have been instantly fatal. "What is this?" he demanded of his science officers. "And how are these primitives doing things that are not possible?" The science officers had no answers because their instruments could not detect the changes that were happening inside human bodies, and they could only suggest that more research was needed to understand the phenomenon. Kilos ordered a full military assessment of the human threat and dispatched additional forces to Earth to support his commanders there. And for the first time since the invasion he started to wonder if he had underestimated the species he had conquered. In the Resistance headquarters beneath the ruins of Seoul, Yuna addressed a gathering of cell leaders from around the world through a secure communication network, and she told them that the time had come to stop hiding and start fighting. "They thought we were finished," she said with fire in her eyes and steel in her voice. "And they thought that conquering our world meant defeating our people. But they were wrong, and now they are beginning to understand just how wrong they were." Dr. Beek stood beside her and explained to the gathered leaders what he had learned about the ignition and how it was spreading through the human population. And he told them that every battle and every moment of danger gave more humans the chance to awaken to their true potential. "We are not becoming something new," the old physicist said, "but rather we are remembering something old that our ancestors knew and that our bodies never forgot. And the power that burns inside us now is the same power that allowed humanity to survive ice ages and plagues and predators and every other threat that tried to wipe us from existence." Across the galaxy, other subjugated species began to whisper about the humans who would not stay conquered. And small acts of resistance started to appear on worlds that had been quiet for centuries. And the Verithan Dominion began to realize that the fire they had tried to stamp out on Earth was spreading to places they could not control. 6 months had passed since the Verithan Dominion declared victory over Earth. And in that time, the scattered survivors of humanity had done what humans have always done when faced with impossible odds. They had refused to die. Commander Yuna Park now led a resistance cell of 47 fighters who moved through the old subway tunnels beneath, so like ghosts that the enemy could not catch. And they had connected with other cells across the globe through a network of abandoned mines and underground passages that the Verithans did not know existed. The raids they conducted were small and careful because they could not afford to lose anyone, and most of their operations focused on gathering food and medicine and weapons rather than fighting the enemy directly. But even these small acts of defiance kept hope alive in the hearts of those who had survived. Yuna sat in their current hideout and watched as a young medic named Sejun Choi examined a fighter who had been wounded in a raid 3 days earlier. And what she saw made her lean forward with sudden interest. "This is not possible," Sejun said as he removed the bandages from the fighter's leg and stared at the wound that should have taken weeks to heal. Because this injury was deep enough to reach the bone, and now it looks like it happened 2 months ago instead of 3 days. The wounded fighter, a woman named Haein Lim, looked at her leg and then looked at Sejun with confusion on her face. "I feel stronger than I did before I was hurt," she said in a voice filled with wonder. "And my senses feel sharper, like I can hear things that I should not be able to hear and see details that I should not be able to see." Yuna stood and walked over to where Dr. Beek was working on his portable computer in the corner of the room. And she told him what Sejun had discovered. The old physicist nodded and pulled up data that he had been collecting from resistance fighters across the network. And his face showed no surprise at the news. "It is happening just as I predicted," he said. "And the ignition is spreading through our people in response to the constant stress and danger that we face every day." He showed her reports from other cells that described similar phenomena. And Yuna read about fighters who had developed enhanced strength and others who had gained the ability to react to threats faster than any normal human could. "Our bodies are adapting to survive," Dr. Beak explained, "because that is what human bodies have always done throughout our evolutionary history. And now that our species faces extinction, our DNA is unlocking abilities that have been dormant for thousands of generations." 2 weeks later, the Verithans captured a group of 12 resistance fighters during a supply raid that went wrong. And word spread through the network that they had been taken to a Dominion facility for study. Yuna wanted to launch a rescue mission, but she knew that attacking a Verithan facility directly would be suicide. And she had to make the painful decision to wait and hope that their captured friends would find a way to escape. They never did. The Verithans examined the 12 humans and ran every test that their advanced technology could perform, and they found nothing unusual in their biology because the changes that were happening inside human bodies were too subtle for alien instruments to detect. Supreme Arbiter Kelos reviewed the research reports and concluded that the rumors about enhanced humans were nothing more than battlefield exaggeration from soldiers who were embarrassed to admit that they had been bested by inferior creatures. And he ordered the 12 prisoners executed as an example to others who might think about resisting. News of the execution spread through the resistance network and brought grief and anger to every cell. But it also brought something else. It brought determination. 1 month after the executions, Yuna led a raid on a Verithan supply convoy that was supposed to be a simple hit-and-run operation. But everything went wrong when reinforcements arrived faster than expected, and her team found themselves surrounded by enemy soldiers. Yuna watched as her fighters fell back to defensive positions, and she knew that they were all going to die in this tunnel unless something changed. And she felt fear grip her heart as she realized that this was the end. But then something happened inside her that she could not explain. Time seemed to slow down around her, and she felt heat spreading through her body like fire was running through her veins. And suddenly she could see everything with perfect clarity and understand exactly what needed to happen. She moved before her conscious mind could tell her to move, and her body flowed through the tunnel like water through a pipe. And she struck the first Verithan soldier before he could raise his weapon, and then spun to take down the second one before he knew she was there. 6 Verithan soldiers died in the span of seconds that felt like hours to Yuna. And when the last one fell, she stood in the tunnel breathing hard and trying to understand what had just happened to her. Her fighters stared at her with expressions that mixed fear and awe and hope. And Saijun rushed forward to check her vital signs and found that her heart rate and neural activity were off every chart he had. "You ignited," Dr. Beak said when she returned to base and told him what had happened. "And you are the first person I have witnessed who is fully awakened to the potential that exists inside all of us." In the weeks that followed, word spread through the resistance network that Commander Park had become something more than human. And then more reports started coming in from other cells about fighters who had experienced similar awakenings during moments of extreme danger. The ignition was spreading, and humanity was changing. And for the first time since the invasion began, the survivors started to believe that they might actually have a chance. Morale rose throughout the underground as stories of ignited humans passed from cell to cell. And fighters who had been ready to give up found new strength in the knowledge that their species was not as weak as the Verithans. Believed above ground, the Dominion continued to strip Earth's resources and patrol its streets with soldiers who had no idea that Something was stirring in the darkness below them. And Supreme Arbiter Kelos remained confident that the conquest was complete and that the scattered remnants of humanity posed no real threat. He could not have been more wrong. Commander Una Park pressed her face against the cold concrete wall of the bunker and watched the sky through a crack in the ceiling above her head, and what she saw made her heart feel like it was being crushed inside her chest. The Verithan warships hung in the air like massive black clouds that blocked out the sun over Shoal, and their shadows stretched across the ruined city for kilometers in every direction. And Una could hear the distant thunder of their weapons as they continued to destroy what little remained of humanity's once proud civilization. 3 days was all it had taken for them to break the unified defense fleet that humanity had spent 2 centuries building. And 3 days was all it had taken for them to reduce Earth's greatest cities to burning rubble. And 3 days was all it had taken for them to prove that humans were nothing compared to the might of the Verithan Dominion. Una turned away from the crack and looked at the 43 survivors who huddled in the bunker around her. And she saw fear in their eyes that matched the fear she felt in her own heart. And she knew that none of them had expected the war to end so quickly or so completely. A young soldier named Minjae Kang crawled over to her position and whispered that the communication relay was picking up a broadcast from the Verithan command ship. And Una nodded and followed him to the corner where their equipment was set up. And she knelt beside the speaker and listened to the voice that came through. The voice belonged to Supreme Arbiter Kelos, the commander of the Verithan invasion force, and his words were being transmitted across every frequency on every planet in the galaxy so that all species could hear the news of humanity's defeat. Let it be known throughout the Dominion and beyond that the species called humanity has been pacified. Kelos said in a tone that carried no emotion at all. And let it be recorded that their world called Earth is now property of the Verithan Dominion and will serve as a mining colony for the extraction of core minerals that our empire requires. Una clenched her fists as she listened to the alien commander dismiss her entire species like they were nothing more than insects that had been stepped on. These humans built impressive machines and developed technology that briefly allowed them to resist our advance, Kelos continued. But they lacked the biological superiority and the evolutionary advantages that would have made them worthy opponents. And in the end, they fell as all weak species fall when faced with the strength of the Dominion. The broadcast ended and silence filled the bunker. And Una looked at the faces around her and saw that some of them were crying while others stared at nothing with empty eyes that had lost all hope. An old man pushed through the group and made his way to Una's side. And she recognized him as Dr. Jinho Beek, a physicist who had been working on classified research before the invasion began. And his white hair was covered in dust, and his lab coat was torn, but his eyes still held a spark of something that looked almost like excitement. "Commander Park," he said in a quiet voice that only she could hear, "I need to show you something that I discovered in my research. And I believe it may be the key to our survival as a species." Una wanted to tell him that there was no key and no hope and no future for humanity. But something in his voice made her follow him to a corner of the bunker where he had set up a small portable computer that somehow still functioned. "Before the invasion, I was studying the human genome and looking for anomalies that might explain certain phenomena that have been observed throughout our history," Theodore Beek explained as he pulled up data on the screen. "And what I found was something that I did not expect, and something that I believe the Verithans do not know about." He showed her a series of charts and graphs that meant nothing to her untrained eyes. But she listened as he explained what they represented. "Humans evolved on what other species call a death world," he said. "And our planet tried to kill us every single Day with its predators, and its diseases, and its natural disasters, and its extreme temperatures. And in response, our bodies developed something remarkable. He pointed to a section of genetic code that was highlighted in red on the screen. This is dormant potential that exists in every human being. He continued, and it is like an emergency protocol that our DNA holds in reserve for moments when our survival is truly threatened. And I believe that the stress of this invasion may be triggering something in our people that has not been seen for thousands of years. Yuna shook her head and told him that she did not understand what he was trying to say. I'm saying that we are not finished. Beak replied with a small smile on his weathered face. And I'm saying that the Verathans made a mistake when they assumed that conquering our world meant defeating our species. He pulled up another set of readings that he had taken from survivors in the bunker over the past 2 days. Look at these numbers, he said, and tell me what you see. Yuna studied the data and noticed that certain biological markers were elevated far beyond normal levels in several of the survivors. And she saw that heart rates and neural activity and hormone production were all showing patterns that did not match anything in standard medical databases. What does this mean? She asked. Beak turned to face her, and his eyes held a light that seemed to burn with certainty. It means that something inside us is waking up, he said. And it means that our bodies are beginning to adapt to the threat we face in ways that we have never seen before. And I call this phenomenon the ignition because it is like a fire that is starting to burn inside our people. Above them, the Verathan ships continued their work of stripping Earth's resources and establishing control over the conquered population. And Supreme Arbiter Kelos sat in his command chair and felt satisfied that another weak species had been added to the Dominion's collection. He gave no thought to the small pockets of resistance that his sensors detected in underground locations around the planet, because he knew that they would be dealt with in time and that humans pose no real threat to his forces on 200 conquered worlds across the galaxy. Other species watched the broadcasts and saw humanity fall just as they had fallen before them, and they felt the familiar despair of knowing that the Dominion could not be stopped and that resistance was pointless. But deep in the bunker beneath, Soul Dr. Beak continued to study his readings, and Yuna began to feel something stirring in her chest that she could not explain. And around them, the survivors started to notice changes in themselves that should not have been possible. The Verathans thought that humanity was finished and that their conquest was complete. But they did not understand that they had just lit a match in a room full of fuel, and they did not know that the true power of humanity had not yet begun to burn.